I thought for an audience like this, what can I say about analytics that you wouldn't know? This little point in preaching to the converted. So I thought, let me talk about a topic that's sort of dear to us and which we tend to focus on a lot, which is how to convert what we do in data and analytics into money, right, in some form or another. So that's the sort of theme that that I'm going to cover today. Also, interestingly, on the photograph, if you look at, there is a human and a machine. So we have a concept called the age of width that we believe in, which is humans work with machines to produce the best outcome, and it's not one or the other, right? So also, you will see a little bit of an India bias in my talk as we go along. So all that I'm going to sort of cover is 4 stories. If there's lack of time, 3 stories. And then some of the learnings that we've had from going through these, right? So without, okay. So the first thing that we think about when we look at how do we create business impact, the model is obviously important. The data that we get for the model is important. The proxies we have to choose is important. But for the impact, we need to think beyond the model and even beyond the data, right? So we sort of have this thinking that we do, which is we start with the broader digitization journey, right? So the first thing, let's say, that we digitize is the process. And all of these have interlinkages, which I'll just come to in probably a minute or so, right? The process, digitized process, generates digitized data, or we get data from elsewhere. Once we have this data, we are able to apply algorithms on it, understand patterns, et cetera, which we call digitization of cognition in general. So that's the part where most of us in this room perhaps work. And then the outcome of that, sometimes we have to sense, right? So those could be sometimes driven by IoT, sometimes driven by measurements that we do, et cetera. But it's important to measure that, right? So that's the digitization of sensing. And that goes back into either a process or a data. Now, all of these have interplays because what we sense might feed into data, what we have as data might feed into the process, what we have as an output of the cognition or the algorithm might feed into the process or the data back as well, right? What we call publish and subscribe. So there is this whole continuum of digitization that is very, very critical to actually achieving the outcomes out of the models that we build, right? So the way we like to think about it is there's the real world, and then we have our models in it. How do we make the real world realize the value of our models and actually get value out of it, right? Which we can land in our P&L or balance sheet or otherwise that we can talk to our businesses about, right? So essentially, once sort of we fix on this process, sometimes also the other part which does happen is the outputs of our data insights, our algorithms, need to go back to either a customer or a vendor or someone in our ecosystem or internal employees or et cetera. So that also requires a process capability to be able to consume and affect that change in the business process that it's sort of a part of, right? So I'll just talk about some of these to sort of exemplify in the stories that we go through and might be, otherwise it's a little nebulous, right? From a value driver's perspective, right? So what drives value out of analytics? We broadly look at 4 types of value or 4 drivers of value, right? Obviously, and at a high level, and then we look at how do we double-click again and look into it in more detail, right? So uplifting revenue, obviously critical, growth agenda for every organization. We have how do we reduce costs in uncertain, tough times, sometimes important, always good. Asset efficiency, which is if I have CapEx, I've spent a bunch of money, how do I make more money out of the bunch of money that I've already spent, right? So that's about asset efficiency. And competitive advantage is a little bit of a loose term. Perhaps it's the outcome of all this is how can I be better than my competition using AI, ML, analytics, et cetera. It's both an internal and an external outlook, right? In simple terms, perhaps. Why will the market and the real market, which is our customers, consumers, as well as the stock market, which is valuing us, why will they both look at us and actually infer that advantage to the company, right? So that's the last driver, right? So just let me get to the stories then. The first one. So we've done this at a number of companies, but this one that I'm just going to talk about. So it's about how do we extract more value out of customers as a company using analytics, right? So there are multiple phases in the life cycle of a customer. We acquire a customer. We have what's called the babysitting phase, which is first experience of the brand. Then we have the core sort of customers who are engaged, and then we have the alumni who are sort of looking to attrite or looking at other options, etc. Through this, how do we maximize value, right? So, and I think this particular case, the one-line problem statement was revenues are plateauing, attrition is increasing. What do I do, right? So, how do we sort of break this problem down and sort of say, what are the issues? How do we? What do we predict? What do we predict meaningfully that we can actually craft interventions which can actually help those issues that we identify, right? So, so in this particular instance, I'll tell you the scale of this, right? I mean, many of us might have done this. So 15 million customers, data lands up every day at midnight, goes to the cloud, 27 machine learning algorithms run, 5 o'clock, outputs are there, and 8 o'clock, 8 million customers get in 8 different channels. There are 10 offers or action nudges for the day, right, for every day, right? So that's sort of the scale of what's possible. Now, what are the 3 or 4 key issues here, right? So one is, what should be the offer, right, which is obviously your personalization. We use a recommendation engine here. And that was based on a sparse matrix algorithm, which was like the Netflix issues, right? So if you have 1 million customers and 1 million products, what is best for which customer? How do you sort of, in that sparse matrix, how do you predict that, right? So the second key issue here is on price, right? So even if it's the same product, how do I customize the price for that particular person? And how do I sort of build in a playbook which is driven either by rules or by scores that I am actually able to apply this, right, and automate it to a certain extent. So the simple mechanism we started using was the riskier the customer, the better the, more competitive the price, right? So basically, it's a propensity-based laddering that we do, right? So the third issue is what we call intent, and this is where human thinking comes in a little bit, right? So intent is broadly about, if we look at a specific cohort, small segment of customers, or a sub-region within a larger region, etc., depending on whether the brand is a leader, the brand is a challenger, or a brand is, and the aspirations of the brand, you may need to actually look at what kind of interventions or those messages actually go across, right? So I think offer, price, and intent, right? So, and that is very critical to match the customer to the offer, which is a recommendation, and the price that we are trying to offer them to, right? How do we move that customer from a value X to a value Y, which is our intent of actually doing this whole exercise, right? So typically across companies, we've seen incremental revenue uplift of 4 to 6% in a very hyper-competitive markets where revenues have actually been plateauing or reducing. So it is quite significant in that sense as well, right? Now, where the process also starts to impinge, which was the first sort of part, is data. Okay, telcos have a lot of data. I mean, they know exactly where you and I are at this point in time, so they do really know a lot of data. But from the perspective of actually being able to run the process, so if I want to have 15 million customers getting a customized, let's say, offer, even let's say 1,000 customized offer, the engine of marketing and the ability to deliver those meaningfully to those customers whom we are targeting in the language of their choice, in the communication that we intend, which will move the needle to the desired impact, it may or may not exist, right? So in many of the clients where we work with, that process actually imposes limitations on what we can do, right? Therefore, I think it's important to sort of look at how we interact with the real world limitations that it produces on us, and then take the smartest way out, right? Or what we call perhaps street smarts. Take the right approach, which take the sensible approach, which may not be the sort of the ideologically right approach from time to time, right? So, and it's applicable across different sorts of industries. This is just an example that I've taken. If I go to the next one, story number 2. Story number 2 is about forecasting prices of commodities, right? So it's a large company that does big project implementations, and they have to buy products from time to time. So let's say they're bidding today for a project. Implementation happens in 24 to 36 months. They have to buy a lot of stuff between now and then, right? So if inflation actually increases the cost of what inputs that they have to buy, they'll make no money. In fact, they'll lose money on the projects, right? So the core of it is eventually boiling down to what commodities they use and how that sort of, inflation of that or a future price view of that can actually matter, right? So essentially, the single line problem is, how do we sort of ensure that we make the right buying decisions? Now, there are 3 sort of sub-questions to that, which are given here, right? So what to buy? So there are multiple grades of everything, right? So there's no single, I'll take a random example and pardon me if there are some folks who do this, right? So if I'm not very accurate, because that's not the example that I'm taking. So if you want to make a soap, perhaps you need, 2 ml of fragrance and 20 ml of some oil and some, and to package it, you need some low-density polyethylene dabba or whatever else you need, right? So you need a bunch of things, right? So if you don't have one of them, if you don't have one fragrance, you can use another fragrance. If you don't have something else, you can always, so this is what we call the recipe of that. You may have alternative recipes for the same product, right? So if you look at, for example, let's say cotton has 3 main grades in the world. Rubber has 6 large grades in APAC. So every sort of commodity has different grades that one can buy. So that is the question of what to buy. How much to buy is, should I basically buy now and stock up my inventory? Should I let my inventory run down and then buy, right? Should I buy, from India or import it, in this case, if you're looking at India? Because it has a very severe impact. If I buy something from outside, obviously, other than the cost, there's at least typically 2 to 3 month lag of actually that ship coming into India, getting through customs, that stuff getting loaded onto a truck which goes into a factory, right? So it takes time, right? So I'm comparing the price of today from a international market with a price in India that might be 3 months from today, right? So fundamental issue. And who to buy from. This is a more strategic issue, saying, am I buying from the right set of people? What is it do I need to change the mix of what I do, right? So these are decisions that buyers grapple with on a daily basis, and their bonus is determined by how much savings they do from their skill, right? So that's also a nebulous issue, because if it was 100 rupees and I got it for 80 rupees, your savings is 20. But nobody knows what that 100 rupees actually is, right? Because it depends on which market, what grade, how are you looking, and many of these are not published or traded goods either. So essentially, what we sort of did is saying, let's predict these prices and then figure out a way that these can be used in actually making the decisions that how do we buy, right? So we had a daily model which forecasts, and daily models typically have to have more trading variables which make more impact, right? And because we have a lot of history, we could use LSTM and some interesting models. Weekly is more, and at least monthly, for instance, if you look at, let's say, a 12-month period, tends to get more fundamental, right? And if we got into some other, like cotton, we have, like, for example, broken rice, which is one of the commodities which goes into alcohol, for instance, in some types of alcohol, not all. So you might have to go to a mandi level and figure out how the price variations are and how do you optimize, right? So there are layers to the problem that we can, sort of unpack. It may not make sense to buy rice from, whatever, USSR or, Ukraine or whatever, if they have and it's available, right? So essentially, What we then do is try and give a playbook to the buyer. There are 70, 80 variables, let's say demand, supply, producing countries, consuming countries, GDP growth, econometrics, global trade, COVID, which now is a new factor, etc. And therefore, what should your optimized decisions be for the service levels that you want to go into, right? I mean, do you want, let's say, to be safe and order more now, or do you want to try and optimize costs and take a little bit of a chance, right? So, cost of goods sold improved 2 to 4%, which is phenomenal because that goes straight into the bottom line and becomes part of your profits directly, right? So, going to the next story, story number 3. I'll just quickly maybe breeze through this. This is for a leading tech player that we did. Most of you might have done most of this or be aware of it. But the interesting thing was this particular player had a 50-50 mix of B2B, which is business to business, selling to businesses rather than selling to individuals like you and me, right? So in the B2C world, there is understanding of how pricing moves, how promotion can be optimized, how your marketing effectiveness is, etc. to some extent, right? I mean, many of that journey has happened. But there is significant issues in trying to sort of look at it from a B2B lens, right? Which is if you're selling to companies, right? So one of the other interesting things that we did was also use geo-intelligence, which is try and look at 1 by 1 or 2 by 2 square kilometer of geography, lat long, and then try to see what's the sort of potential there, what are the brands which are present, relevant to that set, and then try to figure out how do we overlay our internal strengths onto that, right? So which sort of gives us the ability to play the right, I mean, sort of, we call it the how to, where to play and how to win sort of questions, how do we answer, right? So B2B specifically, pricing itself is a very nebulous concept because what happens is, in most of the companies, the most articulate and compelling salesman who makes it strategic, his own client gets the best deals, right? So it's as simple as that. It's very difficult to actually benchmark against anything. It's even difficult to get a cohort, right, a segment to say, this is comparable to that, right? Because these are all, I mean, so for example, let's say, if Radisson Blu is selling to this hall to, let's say, all of us, right, to Deloitte or to AIM or to somebody else, right? So what are the discounts they offer and how, right? And are they doing it, so how do they increase the value of what they do? So that's the challenge, and actually the value that you get is significantly high because this is an area where science actually imposes a certain level of discipline on an area which was completely gut feel and this thing. B2C obviously has its own benefits. It's much more straightforward. But of course, in a multi-echelon supply chain, etc., your distributor network, etc., there are complexities that come, especially based on how the brand is. So the idea is how do we increase the efficacy of every dollar that we spend, right? So. And I'll go to the next story because I want to spend a little bit more time perhaps on that one. So this was about, the last theme is about how do I get a new business model driven by analytics, right? So this was for a tire company, a leading tire manufacturer. And essentially they were saying, so if you're a fleet owner, for the fleet business, right? So if you're a fleet owner, you have 100 trucks. Each truck has on an average 10 tires. You need 1,000 tires in a 12 to 18 month time frame that you need to buy, right? And not all of them may go at the same time, but you need to buy that. And let's say the average lifespan, for simplicity's sake, of a tire is 100,000 kilometers, right? So now the key issue is, if I acquire a new customer, what should the price be that I quote to them, right? If I quote too high, I won't get the business. If I quote too low, I make losses, right? So I mean, I don't make EBITDA and stuff. So essentially, there are a lot of variations in this as well. So if I use the truck for mining versus I use it to move general goods on golden quadrilaterals, the wear and tear is different and the lifespan is different. And this is true for every product which is an as-a-service model or which aspires to be as a service model, right? if you look at hilly terrain, there the wear and tear is more compared to normal terrain. If you look at, I won't say which is which, but let's say a Tata truck versus a Volvo truck, it's different. If you look at a tractor trailer versus a tipper, right, the wear and tear is different. So there are so many variations that it's not easy to actually quote a price even. And it takes a lot of research to actually quote a price, right? So how do we sort of scale this business by removing those barriers, use algorithms, use analytics to basically be able to come up with a pricing which gives sufficient meat so that one doesn't sort of get into trouble with it, right? The other part of this is how do I make sure that whatever I've quoted, that if that tire is 100,000 kilometers, if it ends in 80,000, then I have to give a replacement tire because I'm an as a service, right? If it goes to 120,000 kilometers, then I make money, right? Because I give the replacement only after that. So essentially, this is where we looked at how do we get IoT in, right? And we had some devices. So there's tire pressure and temperature monitoring systems, what are called TPMS, right? So you can actually have devices in tires which will give you the tire pressure and temperature, which has a significant impact on longevity of the tire. The other is what we call the tread depth of the tire, right? So tread depth of the tire, the tread, typically starts at 20 millimeter, and if it goes below, there's a threshold like 4 millimeter or 5 millimeter, then you have to discard it, right? It's end of life. Now, how do you deal with, for example, it happens, right? Truck gets onto a footpath and there's a cut or whatever in the side of the tire. That's a catastrophic failure. How do you deal with it, right? So, so each of these could have different implications on pricing, right? So, and how do you actually deal with it? So, we did a pilot with the IoT devices, got that data in, and how to actually looking at pricing, and then subsequently managing that pricing so that we eventually end up at the EBITDA that we are looking for or higher, right? So I think that's the objective. And for the fleet owner, he gets a model or she gets a model which is a cost per kilometer per tire, right? Instead of actually having to buy the tire, right? So there's a whole lot of ecosystem also which goes in. So if somebody has to buy the tire, right? I mean, unless I rent a tire as a tire manufacturer, which I may not want to do. So I get in financial players who want to do this, right? So who will actually be able to do. The second is, for example, people who, let's say, a truck comes from Delhi to Coimbatore. How do I know what's the tread depth in Coimbatore, right? So I need a network of, let's say, depots or, workshops of people who can actually look at it and say, okay, and that can be reliably, data which we can rely on, right? So it's, again, the whole point being the model will tell us potentially what's the usable life of a product, what's the price we should quote, and how do we ensure that we achieve the outcomes that we are willing to or we desire to do. And the more we grow this model, the more our loss will be if you're not able to do this well, right? So therefore, it's a very interesting sort of business model innovation that is pretty much going to be made or make or break driven by data and analytics, right? So to the next one. In summary, I have about 6 minutes or so, 5 for questions and maybe a minute or so on this. So not to overdo the math, it's simple. We are looking at what's the total value that we deliver out of analytics to a client and how do you measure that, right? And one of the interesting things of what really matters and what doesn't matter, we look at direct value. So if there's a revenue uplift or a cost decrement which happened directly because of a model that we did, that's what we call direct value. Indirect is, let's say, I did a forecast better for demand and therefore it helped me, let's say, procure better or manufacture better or, manage my assortment better. That's indirect. Opportunity value is if I had not done this, what else would I have done? That's one way to look at opportunity. Or the one, for example, is there a new business model which is a new opportunity, business opportunity for me as a company, but I'm only not going to be able to take advantage of it unless, I have this capability to make it count. And efficiency, obviously. So, for example, one of the large companies we're working with, has 1,000 procurement buyers. Can we save 500 of them the time that they spend by giving these insights to them so if they have this, 70, 80 variables, some of them have lead and lag, 500 features, some of them are important. So how do they decide, right? Humanly, it's not possible, right? So how do we become their sort of decision support to help gain efficiency, right? So I think that's the point on efficiency. So we look at that as the total value and try and agree with business that it's indeed the total value. And then, hopefully that makes an impact that matters to business, right? So these are some of the learnings that we've had from, and of course we have a bunch of other stories, but so let me pause there and see if there's any comments, observations, or questions. Thank you.